That night, I did nothing wrong. The table was perfect, the wine appropriately chilled, and my husband walked in believing he controlled the entire narrative. When he announced at our 25th anniversary dinner that he was leaving me for another woman, he thought he was setting our marriage on fire. He had no idea I stopped waiting to be chosen months ago. In reality, he simply stepped into a trap of financial secrets and signatures he built himself. My name is Aurora West. I am 44 years old, and for the better part of my adult life, my world has been anchored to the quiet, cedar-lined shores of Briar Point, Minnesota. It is the kind of lake town where secrets are usually kept behind thick oak doors and manicured hedges, where the surface of the water remains placid, even when the currents underneath are violent. I had spent the entirety of this crisp autumn day preparing a dinner to celebrate our 25th wedding anniversary. I stood in the center of the kitchen of an old, sprawling craftsman house that I had brought back to life almost entirely with my own two hands, my own sweat, and, crucially, my own private funds. The air in the house was heavy with the rich, intoxicating aromas of a meal that had been dictated by a quarter-century of habit. I was cooking the exact menu that my husband, Dean, had demanded so many years ago, a menu he treated not as a request, but as an unchangeable family tradition. In the oven, a massive prime rib was slow roasting, the outer crust perfectly seasoned with coarse sea salt and cracked black pepper, slowly rendering down over the course of 5 long hours. On the stove, I watched a pan of brown butter foam and turn a deep, nutty amber, ready to be folded into the heavily creamed mashed potatoes. Beside it sat a skillet of fresh green beans, waiting to be blistered and tossed with toasted almonds. Resting on the marble island, filling the room with the warm scent of cinnamon and caramelized sugar, was a freshly baked bourbon apple tart. I moved through the kitchen with the practiced, mechanical grace of a woman who had performed this exact choreography countless times. I wiped down the counter, adjusted the temperature of the oven, and checked the dining room table for the 4th time. The table was a masterpiece of domestic illusion. In the center sat an elegant arrangement of dark autumnal flowers, flanked by tall ivory taper candles, but the true centerpiece was the glassware. I had carefully washed and set out the heavy, ornate crystal goblets that I had inherited from my Aunt Marlowe. Aunt Marlowe was a fiercely independent woman who had lived life entirely on her own terms, and when she handed these glasses down to me, she offered a piece of advice I had never forgotten. She told me, "Do not save good things for a perfect day. Use them for a memorable day." As I traced the intricate cut-glass patterns with my index finger, I knew with an absolute, chilling certainty that today would be memorable. Though not for the reasons a 25th anniversary usually dictates. My phone buzzed against the marble countertop. It was a text message from my eldest daughter, Willa. She was 23 years old, sharply intelligent, and rapidly making a name for herself at a boutique interior design firm in the city. Her text read that she was wrapping up a client meeting and would be bringing a very expensive bottle of full-bodied red wine. A few moments later, my son, Rowan, sent a quick message. He was 21, a quiet but deeply observant boy with grease permanently stained under his fingernails from his shifts at the local custom audio shop. He told me he had just punched out, had cleaned up, and promised to be at the house right on time. They were good kids, entirely unaware that the foundation of the home they were returning to was about to be tested. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the evening hour, and shortly after, the familiar crunch of tires on the gravel driveway signaled Dean's arrival. He was later than usual. The heavy wooden front door opened and closed with a solid thud, and his footsteps echoed against the restored hardwood floors. When he finally stepped into the warm, fragrant kitchen, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. Dean looked immaculate, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that fit his lean frame perfectly, his silver-streaked hair styled with effortless precision. In his hand, he held a bottle of vintage French champagne, the kind with a gold foil neck and a price tag that felt more like a grand gesture of guilt than a genuine celebration. I had not asked for champagne. I had specifically planned the wine pairings around the heavy red meats and rich buttery sides, but Dean placed the cold, sweating bottle onto the kitchen island with a sense of definitive authority. He offered me a tight, practiced smile that did not reach his eyes. There was a profound, icy calmness radiating from him, a calculated detachment that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I looked at my husband of 25 years, and I felt no shock. I was not entirely surprised by the coldness in his eyes or the rigid posture of his shoulders. For many months now, I had felt this marriage being quietly, methodically dismantled. It was as if I had been standing inside a massive, intricate machine, listening to the agonizing sound of someone removing it screw by screw, bolt by bolt in the dark. I had felt the distance widening, the strange absences, the shifting of his financial habits, the sudden, unspoken boundaries drawn across our shared life. The only thing I had not known was that Dean would choose this exact night, surrounded by the smell of prime rib and the glow of our children's faces, to finally tear the whole structure down. By the time Willa and Rowan arrived, the house was filled with the illusion of warmth. Willa swept in with her designer coat and a bold bottle of Cabernet, kissing my cheek and marveling at the table setting. Rowan followed soon after, his hair slightly damp from a quick shower, offering me a tight hug that smelled faintly of motor oil and cedar soap. We moved into the dining room, the candles casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. The crystal glasses caught the light, refracting small prisms of amber and gold across the linen tablecloth. I brought out the food, arranging the heavy platters of meat and vegetables with steady hands. We all took our customary seats. I sat at the foot of the table, nearest to the kitchen door, while Willa and Rowan sat across from one another. Dean took his place at the head of the table. Usually, this was the moment he would pick up the carving knife, make a small, predictable joke about his carving skills, and serve the first slice. But tonight, Dean did not reach for the silver carving knife. He did not unfold his heavy linen napkin. He did not even look at the elaborate meal I had spent 10 hours preparing. Instead, he remained standing. He placed his hands flat against the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning slightly white under the pressure. The room went dead silent. The crackle of the fireplace in the adjoining living room suddenly sounded as loud as a gunshot. He cleared his throat, a sharp, abrasive sound that cut through the soft atmosphere of the room. He looked at Willa, then at Rowan, and finally, his gaze settled squarely on me. His eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. "I need to say something before we eat," Dean announced. His voice was steady, rehearsed, and utterly devoid of hesitation. He stood there with the face of a man who believed he was completely in control of the narrative, a man who thought he was holding all the cards and was about to deal the final, devastating blow. But as I sat there, my hands resting quietly in my lap, looking back at him through the flickering candlelight and the glittering reflection of Aunt Marlowe's crystal, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. I felt my heart slow down to a steady, rhythmic beat. In that exact fraction of a second, I understood something with absolute, terrifying precision. Tonight was not going to be the night of my heartbreak. Tonight was not going to be the tragedy of Aurora West. Dean thought he was standing at the head of the table to destroy my life. He did not realize that I had already spent months studying the blueprints of his betrayal. Tonight was not my breaking point. It was simply the night the truth finally changed hands. It started exactly 8 months before that evening. The shift was not a sudden earthquake, but a quiet, microscopic erosion of our daily routines. I began to notice that my husband was no longer truly living inside our home. He was merely passing through it, treating our shared space like an airport lounge between connecting flights. A husband who is present takes up space. He leaves a mug on the counter. He complains about a draft. He drops his keys loudly into the ceramic bowl by the door. But a husband who is preparing to leave becomes a ghost long before he actually packs a bag. The first tangible sign was his phone. For over 2 decades, he had tossed it carelessly onto the bedside table or left it charging on the kitchen island. Then, subtly, the phone migrated. It stayed in his jacket pocket. It rested face down on the arm of the sofa, right under his hand. Whenever he took a shower, the device vanished into the bathroom with him. I noticed that his call log, usually a cluttered mess of vendor contacts and voicemails, was frequently wiped entirely clean. A man with nothing to hide does not clear his digital footprints on a random Tuesday evening. Then came the sudden weekend business trips. He claimed he needed to visit regional suppliers for his employer, Meridian Habitat Supply. He packed a small leather duffel bag, kissed my cheek with practiced detachment, and drove off toward Cedar Ridge. The problem was that I knew the corporate structure of Meridian Habitat Supply intimately. I knew for an absolute fact they did not have an official branch, a warehouse, or even a minor vendor located anywhere near Cedar Ridge. I swallowed that piece of geography and let it sit in the back of my mind, a jagged little stone I refused to ignore. The second mistake he made was an error of technological carelessness. We shared a wireless printer tucked into the corner of the home office. One Thursday afternoon, I walked in to find the machine humming, spitting out a single sheet of paper. He had clearly tried to print something from his phone while rushing out the door and forgotten to retrieve it. I picked up the warm page. It was an automated electronic filing confirmation. It was not addressed to Meridian Habitat Supply. It was addressed to an entity I had never heard of. Velvet Ember Hospitality, Limited Liability Company. I read the name 3 times. It sounded nothing like the rough industrial world of Habitat Supply. It sounded expensive. It sounded exclusive. I folded the paper perfectly in half, then in quarters, and slipped it into the bottom drawer of my desk. The third slip occurred right in the entryway, bathed in the harsh afternoon sunlight. The mail carrier had just dropped a stack of letters through the slot. I was walking down the stairs as my husband bent down to scoop them up. Among the catalogs and utility bills was a thick, rigid cardboard envelope from a major national bank. I saw both of our names printed clearly on the address label. Before I could reach the bottom step, his hand snapped over the envelope. He shuffled it behind a magazine with the frantic speed of a shoplifter, but my vision has always been sharp. In that fraction of a second, I caught the bold, capitalized words stamped across the bottom corner of the label, pre-closing package. A lesser woman might have demanded answers right then and there. A different wife might have waited until he was asleep, crept into the dark living room, and desperately tried to unlock his phone. The person who commits the betrayal always banks on the betrayed losing their mind. They rely on the tears, the screaming, the baseless accusations, and the hysterical demands for the truth. They want you to strike first without concrete evidence so they can label you crazy, dismiss your intuition, and comfortably maintain the upper hand. I refused to give him that satisfaction. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask a single leading question over our morning coffee. I maintained absolute, terrifying silence. Instead of starting a messy war in the kitchen, I went to work. I sat down at my laptop, opened a secure browser, and bypassed the domestic drama entirely. I navigated directly to the County Public Records database. I paid the minor administrative fees out of a separate account and began pulling the threads. I searched the corporate registry for Velvet Ember Hospitality. I found the articles of incorporation. I traced the registered agents and the listed addresses. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a sickening clarity. My husband was deeply entangled in the development of a high-end luxury event venue situated precisely in the scenic hills of Cedar Ridge. He was funneling his time, his energy, and clearly a significant capital into a massive commercial project that I knew absolutely nothing about. But the infidelity of his time and focus was not the revelation that made my blood run cold. As I dug deeper into the public filings, requesting digital copies of the associated property deeds and commercial loan summaries, a specific document materialized on my screen. It was a secondary financial guarantee commitment attached to the primary commercial lease for the venue. This document essentially promised that if the business failed to meet its exorbitant financial obligations, the personal assets of the guarantors would be seized to cover the deficit. I scrolled to the final page, where the signatures were executed in thick black ink. There was his signature, bold and familiar, and right beneath it, resting on the designated line for the spouse, was my name. I sat perfectly still, the blue light of the monitor casting a pale glow across my face. I stared at the looping letters of my own name for a very long time. The cursive was elegant, perhaps a little too forced, but it was definitively not mine. I had never seen this document. I had never authorized this risk. I had never held the pen that dragged my financial security into the crosshairs of a commercial banking institution. The breath left my lungs in a slow, jagged exhale. The reality of the situation mutated from a painful marital betrayal into a catastrophic legal threat. He had not just found someone else, and he had not just started a secret business. He had weaponized my identity. He had forged my signature to secure funding for a life he was building without me. He had effectively strapped me to a massive debt bomb, and he had done it with the cold, calculated assumption that I would simply remain in the dark until the explosion tore my life apart. I closed the laptop softly. The profound sadness that usually accompanies the death of a marriage evaporated, replaced instantly by a sharp, crystalline focus. The man I had spent over 2 decades with viewed me not as a partner, but as an asset to be leveraged and discarded. He thought I was just a naive woman waiting in a quiet house. He had vastly underestimated the danger of leaving a trail of paperwork for a woman who actually reads the fine print. I knew then that I could not afford to mourn. I had to build a fortress. I did not drive down the highway to Cedar Ridge to throw a heavy brick through the gleaming glass windows of the new venue. I did not spend my evenings desperately trying to track down the other woman to scream at her in the middle of a crowded coffee shop. The biological instinct to destroy the source of your pain is incredibly loud, but the instinct to survive a catastrophic threat is silent, methodical, and entirely ruthless. Exactly 2 days after I discovered the forged financial guarantee, I parked my car in the underground garage of the most intimidating legal building in the city and walked into the offices of Hollis & Associates. Nessa Hollis was not the kind of family law attorney who offered warm cups of tea, soft tissues, or sympathetic platitudes about the grieving process of divorce. She was a razor-sharp, fiercely pragmatic litigator who specialized exclusively in the surgical extraction and protection of highly complex marital assets. Her retainer was exorbitant, billing at $600 an hour, and within the very first 10 minutes of our initial consultation, I knew without a shadow of a doubt she was worth every single penny. Sitting quietly to her right was a man named Calvin Rhodes, a private forensic document examiner with the unassuming demeanor of a high school history teacher and the terrifyingly discerning eye of a master jeweler. I opened my leather tote bag and slid the printed copies of the Velvet Ember House commercial lease and the attached financial guarantee across the polished expanse of the mahogany conference table. Calvin adjusted his thick, wire-rimmed glasses, pulled a specialized jeweler's loop from his breast pocket, and leaned heavily over the illuminated pages. He did not need a long time to confirm my worst fears. Within 20 minutes of examining the ink patterns and digital artifacts, he pointed out the hesitant stroke paths, the incorrect pressure points, and the highly unnatural slant of the cursive loops. It was a forgery, definitively, technically, and legally. But the fleeting relief of having a professional confirm that I had not signed away my own life was immediately crushed by Nessa outlining the true, horrifying scope of my legal jeopardy. She explained that the forged signature was not merely a profound betrayal of marital trust. It was an active, ticking financial liability resting squarely on my shoulders. If my husband and his new business venture failed to meet their astronomical loan obligations, the commercial bank would not care one bit about a messy divorce or a cheating spouse. They would simply come to collect their due. They would place a heavy lien on my home. They would freeze my personal accounts, and they would drag my entire net worth into a brutal, protracted legal dispute alongside aggressive corporate investors. Dean had not just quietly stepped out the back door of our marriage. He had securely tied me to the railroad tracks while he comfortably boarded the outbound train. It was during this intense phase of legal discovery that the blurry, undefined outline of the other woman finally sharpened into sharp, undeniable focus. Her name was Sloane Mercer. She was not a naive young secretary, nor was she a random, meaningless encounter at a hotel bar during a business trip. She was an elite, highly connected high society event planner, and her pristine, perpetually smiling face was plastered all over the digital promotional materials for Velvet Ember House. She was the creative visionary, the face of the brand, while my husband was apparently acting as the silent, heavily funded financial muscle. Through a combination of digital footprint tracking, public social media archives, and a few highly discreet inquiries made by Nessa's preferred private investigator, I learned exactly what narrative Dean had been feeding his new partner. He had painted a bleak picture of a tragic, suffocating marriage that was already functionally over in everything but name. He promised Sloane that he was on the absolute verge of total freedom. He openly boasted to her that he would soon be coming into a massive influx of liquid cash, specifically claiming that our sprawling lake house would be put on the market and sold within a matter of mere months. He spoke about my home, the sanctuary I had painstakingly rebuilt with my own sweat, as if it were a plastic poker chip already sitting securely in his side of the table. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his confidence made my stomach turn violently, but it also served to perfectly fuel my focus. Nessa and I began to map the anatomy of his financial arrogance. We desperately needed to know exactly where a mid-level regional manager at a building supply company was getting the massive amount of seed money required to fund a multi-million-dollar luxury hospitality venue. The devastating answer lay buried deep in the gray areas of his corporate expense reports and vendor contracts. By carefully cross-referencing our joint household bank statements with the public incorporation records of Velvet Ember House, we uncovered a secondary, highly concealed stream of income that Dean had kept entirely off our domestic ledger. A significant portion of the new event space's initial construction costs was being heavily subsidized by vague, undefined consulting fees. These fees were quietly routed through a third-party materials vendor, a vendor that just so happened to rely heavily on Dean's direct authorization for massive, lucrative corporate contracts at Meridian Habitat Supply. He was engaging in a highly sophisticated, deeply unethical kickback scheme. He was weaponizing his professional authority to funnel corporate money through shell vendors directly into Sloane Mercer's dream project. The realization hit me with the blunt force of a physical blow to the chest. This was absolutely not a midlife crisis fueled by a fleeting romantic infatuation. This was a cold, calculated, long-term exit strategy. He was aggressively reconstructing his entire existence using stolen corporate funds, his new lover's established social capital, and his wife's forged signature as an ultimate insurance policy against failure. The intense grief that had been simmering just beneath my ribs finally crystallized into something incredibly cold, hard, and unbreakable. I left Nessa's office late that afternoon and drove straight back to Briar Point. I walked into my house, locked the heavy front door, and stood in the absolute center of the living room. I looked closely at the custom oak built-in shelves, the flawlessly restored crown molding, and the expensive wide-plank hardwood floors. Dean had confidently told Sloane this exact house would be liquidated to fund their glamorous future. He had conveniently, perhaps willfully, forgotten the actual, documented financial history of the ground he was standing on. I went down into the basement and pulled 3 heavy fireproof lockboxes from the darkest back corner of the storage room. I spent the next 6 hours sitting alone on the cold concrete floor, meticulously sifting through over 2 decades of bank records, wire transfer receipts, property deeds, and tax documents. I was desperately searching for the paper trail of my own salvation, and I found it exactly where I had carefully filed it years ago, nearly 10 years prior, when we decided to gut and radically expand the property. Dean had claimed we would need to take out a massive secondary mortgage to cover the exorbitant costs, but we never actually did. The incredibly substantial down payment required for our favorable refinancing, the vast sum of money needed for the brand new roof, the capital for the entire custom kitchen renovation, and the sheer volume of cash that had exponentially increased the property's overall market value did not come from our joint savings account. It came entirely, down to the very last cent, from the private inheritance left to me by my Aunt Marlowe Bennett. Under the strict guidelines of our state property law, an inheritance kept in a completely separate account and used directly to improve a shared marital asset created a highly protected, traceable separate property interest. I had the original bank wire transfers, I had the contractor invoices with my name, and only my name, printed clearly on the billing line. I had the certified bank statements unequivocally proving that the absolute bedrock of our home's financial equity belonged exclusively to me. Over the many years of our marriage, Dean had grown so incredibly accustomed to the daily luxury of his surroundings that he had completely forgotten whose money had actually paid for the walls keeping him warm and comfortable. I sat there among the towering stacks of paper, my hands coated in the faint dust of old financial records, and I realized exactly what I had to do next. If I truly wanted to survive the impending explosive detonation of my family unit, I could not afford the dangerous luxury of reacting like a discarded, heartbroken wife. A weeping, hysterical wife is a highly predictable obstacle. A weeping wife can be easily managed, legally manipulated, and eventually pushed out the front door with only a tiny fraction of what she actually deserves. I had to become something else entirely. I had to become the only person in this failing marriage who had actually read, comprehensively understood, and meticulously retained the receipts for every single legal contract we had ever signed. He genuinely thought he was playing a masterful game of emotional dominance, leaving me completely in the dark while he plotted his grand, luxurious escape. He did not know that I had already found the main circuit breaker, and I was about to completely rewire the power structure of the entire house. I hold a Master of Science degree in Operations Management. It was a rigorous, demanding credential I earned long before the heavy, consuming responsibilities of raising a family and managing a sprawling household took precedence over my professional trajectory. But I never truly let those analytical skills atrophy. For over 15 years, quietly and usually long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep, I had been steadily building a boutique process consulting firm. I registered it under the name West Ledger Advisory. It was a highly efficient, tightly run operation, focused primarily on streamlining complex supply chain logistics and internal operational frameworks for local, independent businesses. Dean always treated it with a patronizing smirk, referring to it as my little side project or a cute way for a restless wife to keep her mind occupied. He never once bothered to ask to see the balance sheets, confidently assuming I was bringing in perhaps $5,000 or $10,000 a year just to fund my own minor luxuries. Now that chronically underestimated side project became my absolute lifeline, I deliberately and aggressively increased my workload. I reached out to a former corporate contact and successfully negotiated a highly lucrative, long-term consulting contract with North Vale Process Studio, a rapidly expanding regional manufacturing firm. The retainer alone was substantial, guaranteeing over $120,000 in annual revenue. Under the strict, precise legal guidance of Nessa Hollis, I ensured that every single dollar generated from this massive new contract, along with the existing revenue streams from my other established clients, was routed directly into a newly established, legally protected individual financial account. It was an account meticulously filed under a separate tax identification number, completely invisible to the joint financial ecosystem my husband thought he fully controlled and monitored. With my future income securely walled off, the physical house itself became my personal logistical battlefield. Whenever Dean was away on his fabricated weekend business trips to the hills of Cedar Ridge, acting out his grand fantasy with Sloan Mercer, I executed my asset preservation strategy with surgical precision. I spent roughly 72 hours over 3 consecutive weekends meticulously scanning and backing up over a decade and a half of joint tax returns, quarterly investment portfolio statements, heavily itemized home renovation invoices, my Aunt Marlowe's original estate transfer documents, and our comprehensive homeowner and umbrella insurance policies. I did not just lazily keep these digital copies on a vulnerable cloud server that could easily be subpoenaed or hacked. I loaded them onto 2 heavily encrypted, military-grade external hard drives. I secured the first drive inside a newly rented steel safety deposit box at a private regional bank 3 towns over, completely out of our usual geographic footprint. I handed the second drive directly to Nessa to lock permanently inside the fireproof vault at her downtown law firm. Next came the exhaustive physical inventory of our shared life. I systematically moved through the massive house, room by room, armed with a high-resolution digital camera and a leather-bound notebook. I photographed the exact, pristine condition of the custom chef's kitchen, the flawlessly maintained wide-plank hardwood floors, the high-end imported appliances, and the meticulously landscaped backyard that sloped down toward the lake. I drafted a comprehensive, legally binding catalog of every single family heirloom, every piece of expensive original art, and every piece of antique furniture, cross-referencing them meticulously with the original purchase receipts, shipping manifests, and recent insurance appraisal certificates. I photographed the hand-knotted Persian rug in the study, the massive mahogany grandfather clock in the foyer, and over 40 individual pieces of inherited antique silver. I even quietly logged into our highly sophisticated domestic security network. Operating strictly as the primary administrator, I fundamentally altered the master recovery email addresses, the two-factor authentication protocols, and the primary passwords for both the exterior surveillance and interior monitoring camera systems. If Dean decided to suddenly move out in a fit of manufactured righteous anger and attempted to return weeks later to strip the house of its valuable assets or maliciously damage the property to spite me during a contentious settlement, he would find himself thoroughly documented in high definition and entirely locked out of the digital feed. I was systematically, ruthlessly eliminating his ability to distort the reality of our shared physical and financial assets. The most excruciating, emotionally taxing part of this quiet war was managing the periphery, specifically protecting Willa and Rowan. I absolutely refused to burden my children with the toxic, agonizing truth before it was strictly necessary. They deserved to live their young, independent lives without the heavy, suffocating shadow of their parents' impending legal warfare falling over their shoulders. However, I needed to ensure their individual financial and logistical foundations were completely secure and entirely insulated from the coming blast. I began casually, carefully weaving highly specific questions into our weekly phone calls and Sunday afternoon family visits. I asked Rowan about the exact status of his tuition payments for his upcoming advanced technical audio certification courses. Behind the scenes, I quietly transferred $8,000 directly into his secure educational account, ensuring those funds were fully cleared, properly designated, and safely separated from any joint marital accounts Dean might subsequently attempt to freeze or drain. I sat down with Willa over coffee and casually reviewed the upcoming renewal terms for her expensive city apartment lease. I quietly noted her private mailing address, verified her independent emergency contacts, and ensured she had a secure, independent line of credit that was not in any way co-signed by her father. I was actively reinforcing their lifeboats, checking their life vests, and securing their provisions without ever letting them realize the main ship was actively taking on water and heading straight for the rocks. And then there was Dean. It was a fascinating, deeply sickening psychological study to watch him navigate our shared space during those long, agonizing months of preparation. He interpreted my newly solidified, unshakable calmness as a profound, pathetic form of marital complacency. He looked at me, sitting quietly on the living room sofa reading a financial journal while he actively texted his mistress from across the room, and he saw a woman entirely dependent on the life he graciously provided. He arrogantly mistook my highly disciplined silence for an utter lack of awareness. He genuinely thought the quietness in the house was the sound of my total submission. He lacked the fundamental intellectual and emotional capacity to recognize the distinct, heavy silence of a woman who is meticulously preparing for a prolonged siege. There were evenings when the sheer, suffocating weight of the deception made it physically difficult to draw a full breath. There were nights when he would confidently sit at the kitchen island, drinking a glass of scotch, and talk casually about our joint retirement plans or his hypothetical vision for our financial future. His eyes would be completely flat, utterly devoid of any truth or moral weight, and my immediate, visceral instinct was to throw my glass against the custom tile backsplash and scream every single detail I knew directly into his face. I wanted to tell him I knew about the forged signatures, the diverted vendor funds, and the fake business trips, but the sharp, authoritative voice of my attorney always echoed loudly in the back of my mind. Nessa had been explicitly, aggressively clear during our strategy sessions. She told me to never strike the match too early. She instructed me to let him continue to confidently build his massive, precarious house of cards. She wanted me to let him firmly believe, right up until the very last possible second, that he was the absolute only architect of our destruction, the only one who held a functional map to the exit. So, I waited. I maintained the pristine, flawless illusion of the domestic life he was actively trying to escape. I cooked the elaborate dinners, I smiled warmly at the neighbors during the community association meetings, and I kept the surface of the lake perfectly, deceptively still. I did not wait because I was paralyzed by fear, intimidated by his corporate title, or weakened by a broken heart. I waited because I deeply understood the fundamental, unforgiving mathematics of power and leverage. Anger is a fleeting, chaotic emotion that almost always causes the betrayed party to show their hand entirely too soon, squandering their tactical advantage for a moment of loud, messy catharsis. But strategic patience is an entirely different mechanism. Timing is the ultimate, devastating weapon that highly intelligent people utilize to transform a simple, ugly truth into a fatal, inescapable legal blow. I was not just frantically trying to build an emergency exit route out of a burning building. I was meticulously ensuring that when my husband finally tried to slam the heavy iron door shut on me, the entire structural frame of the building would collapse directly onto his shoulders. We had barely settled into our heavy oak dining chairs, the fabric of our clothes rustling softly in the quiet room, when the atmosphere fundamentally shifted. The massive prime rib sat completely untouched on the silver platter, still radiating heat, yet the temperature in the dining room felt as though it had plummeted below freezing. Dean did not reach for his linen napkin. He did not extend his hand toward the crystal goblet filled with the expensive champagne he had brought. Instead, he sat perfectly rigid at the head of the table. He lifted his chin, his eyes sweeping methodically over the immaculate, candlelit spread that I had spent the last 10 hours orchestrating. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit jacket, a highly specific, practiced gesture I had seen him execute 1,000 times right before he addressed his regional sales team or terminated an underperforming supplier. He took a slow, deliberate breath, entirely commanding the silence of the room. "Things have not been right for a very long time," he announced. His voice was entirely stripped of any tremor, any hesitation, or any warmth. It was a sterile, surgical delivery. He looked directly across the length of the mahogany table, past the intricate floral arrangement, and locked his cold gaze onto mine. "I cannot keep pretending anymore," Dean continued, his tone remarkably steady. "I refuse to keep living a lie. Aurora, we have been drifting apart for years, and we are simply going through the motions. I have met someone else. I am in love with her, and I am moving on." The words dropped onto the center of the table like heavy lead weights. Across from me, Willa froze completely. Her hand had been hovering just inches above the stem of her wine glass, and she remained paralyzed in that exact posture. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of his timing hit her first. Her face contorted, morphing rapidly from shock into a profound, sickening disgust. She stared at the man who had raised her, completely unable to comprehend that he had consciously, deliberately chosen the exact evening of their 25th wedding anniversary, a night I had spent entirely in the kitchen honoring his favorite traditions, to dismantle their family unit. Rowan, sitting opposite his sister, did not look shocked. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his dark eyes narrowing as he analyzed his father's posture, his cadence, and his unflinching eye contact. Rowan worked with complex audio equipment. He understood the difference between a live, raw performance and a pre-recorded, heavily engineered track. My son realized instantly that this was not an emotional, impulsive confession born out of sudden, overwhelming guilt. This was a highly rehearsed script. Dean had practiced this exact speech in the mirror of his hotel room, or perhaps in the passenger seat of his car, perfecting the exact inflection needed to sound authoritative rather than apologetic. "I have already met with my attorney," Dean said, folding his hands resting on the edge of the table. "I want to handle this like adults. I want a civilized, clean divorce. There is no need for this to become a dramatic, drawn-out battle. We will divide things fairly." He then shifted his focus slightly, adopting the condescending, practical tone of a financial advisor lecturing a client who had mismanaged their portfolio. "Obviously, we have to look at the reality of the assets," he stated smoothly. "This house is far too large, and let us be honest, it will probably have to be sold. You cannot possibly carry the property taxes and the upkeep on your own. Aurora, you will struggle to maintain it. I am hoping you will be entirely realistic about this. We need to liquidate, split the equity, and move forward cleanly." That was the true, terrifying shock of the evening. It was not the agonizing confirmation of the other woman, and it was not the definitive end of our marriage. It was his deeply unsettling corporate tone. He was not speaking like a husband who had fundamentally failed his vows and shattered a family. He was speaking like a mid-level executive announcing a corporate restructuring, outlining a logistical decision where I was merely a redundant employee being offered a standard severance package. He expected me to simply nod, accept the terms of my own dismissal, and quietly pack my bag so he could hand the keys of my meticulously restored home over to a real estate agent. He finally stopped talking. He sat back in his chair, a faint, deeply arrogant glimmer of satisfaction settling into the corners of his mouth. He had delivered his lines perfectly. He had seized control of the narrative, dictated the immediate future, and laid out his terms. Now, he was simply waiting for the inevitable, messy emotional collapse he had heavily banked on. I stood completely silent for several long, agonizing seconds. The crackling of the fireplace in the next room was the only sound permitted to exist. I looked at Willa, whose eyes were shining with angry, unshed tears, and then at Rowan, whose jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle twitched near his temple. They both looked at me, bracing themselves for my devastation. They fully expected me to shatter, to scream, to throw Aunt Marlowe's heavy crystal goblet directly at his perfectly groomed head, or to collapse into a weeping, broken shell of a woman. But I did not shed a single tear. My heart rate did not spike, my hands did not shake. Instead of crying, I calmly pushed my heavy oak chair back. The wood scraped loudly, aggressively against the floorboards, shattering the heavy silence Dean had constructed. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my dress. I reached down toward the floor beside my chair, picked up my structured leather handbag, and placed it deliberately onto the table right next to the cooling prime rib. I had intentionally not interrupted him. I had forced myself to sit there and absorb every single arrogant, condescending syllable. I let him confidently outline his brilliant exit strategy. I let him build his towering pedestal of assumed dominance, because his absolute certainty was the perfect, necessary foundation for the devastating fall I was about to initiate. I unsnapped the brass closure of my handbag. I reached inside and pulled out a single, thin, unassuming blue legal folder. It held only a few sheets of paper, but those pages carried the sheer, destructive weight of a loaded weapon. I walked slowly around the edge of the table. The floorboards did not creak beneath my feet. I stopped directly next to his chair. Dean looked up at me, a flicker of genuine confusion finally breaking through his carefully rehearsed, stoic facade. He did not understand the folder. He did not understand my terrifying, unshakable calm. I placed the blue folder directly on top of his pristine, untouched dinner plate. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face close to his, and I spoke in a voice that was incredibly soft, devoid of any anger, and sharp enough to cut through solid bone. "If you want to talk about a clean break," I whispered, "we should start with the dirty signatures." Dean stared at the thin blue folder resting on his pristine china plate. For a long, suffocating moment, He simply looked at it as if it were a foreign object that had materialized out of thin air. His perfectly manicured hands, which had been resting so confidently on the table just seconds before, twitched. Slowly, with a distinct lack of his previous arrogant grace, he reached out and flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. The very first document staring back at him was printed on thick watermarked paper. It was the comprehensive forensic document examination report prepared by Calvin Rhodes. I watched Dean's eyes dart across the dense paragraphs, scanning the highly technical jargon until he hit the bold, underlined conclusion at the bottom of the second page. The report stated, with absolute, unequivocal professional certainty, that the signature on the secondary financial guarantee commitment for the Velvet Ember House commercial lease was a blatant forgery. It explicitly noted the incorrect pen pressure, the unnatural stroke velocity, and the fabricated loop angles. I saw the muscles in Dean's jaw clench so violently, I thought his teeth might shatter. He swallowed hard, a loud, dry sound in the silent dining room, and flipped to the next page. Behind the forensic analysis was a formal letter drafted on the heavy, intimidating letterhead of Hollis & Associates. It was a formal declaration, legally executed by my attorney, confirming that the primary commercial lending institution backing his luxury event space had already been formally notified of the suspected financial fraud. The letter explicitly instructed the bank's legal department that any and all future communications regarding the compromised loan or my personal assets must be directed exclusively through my legal representation. The color began to rapidly drain from my husband's face. He was no longer looking at a grieving wife. He was looking at the sudden, catastrophic freezing of his entire financial future. The multi-million-dollar loan he desperately needed to build his new life with Sloan Mercer was suddenly hanging by a frayed, legally contested thread. But I had not built a single barricade. I had built an entire labyrinth. Dean's trembling fingers turned to the third document in the stack. It was a formally filed court petition requesting my exclusive use and possession of the marital residence for the entire duration of our impending divorce proceedings. Attached to that petition was a terrifyingly detailed, mathematically flawless 40-page appendix. It meticulously traced every single dollar of my Aunt Marlowe's inheritance. It listed the exact dates, the specific wire transfer routing numbers, and the precise contractor invoices that proved my separate property funds had paid for the custom roof, the expansive kitchen remodel, and the massive down payment for our refinancing exactly 4 years ago. He had confidently announced to our children that I could not afford to keep the house. The paperwork in his hands proved that he was the one who fundamentally owned nothing but the dust on the floorboards. He was breathing shallowly now, his chest rising and falling in quick, erratic bursts. He frantically turned to the final section of the blue folder, desperately searching for some sort of leverage, some angle he could manipulate. Instead, he found a printed stack of highly confidential internal electronic communications. They were heavily redacted in certain areas, but the core information was devastatingly clear. They were the email threads detailing the highly suspicious, deeply unethical consulting fees routed from a vendor heavily favored by Meridian Habitat Supply directly into the limited liability company managed by Sloan Mercer. Dean went completely, terrifyingly pale. The corporate confidence he had worn like a tailored suit entirely evaporated. He looked up from the papers, his eyes wide, frantic, and entirely hollow. He looked like a man who had confidently stepped off a ledge, fully expecting to fly, only to realize halfway down that he had forgotten to pack a parachute. I glanced across the table. Willa was staring at her father. Her expression was completely devoid of the heartbroken daughter I had feared she would become. Instead, her eyes were filled with a cold, absolute disgust. She looked at the man who had raised her as if she were inspecting a stranger. Someone fundamentally unrecognizable and entirely repulsive. She did not say a single word, but her silence was a damning, irreversible verdict. Rowan, however, did not remain seated. He pushed his chair back slowly, the wood scraping against the floor in a deliberate, heavy sound. My son stood up to his full height. He did not yell. He did not pound his fists on the table or throw the expensive bottle of wine against the wall. He inherited my quiet, dangerous calm. He looked down at the man shrinking at the head of the table. "You need to pack a bag," Rowan said. His voice was incredibly low, vibrating with a tightly coiled, mature anger. "And you need to leave this house tonight." Dean blinked, snapping his head toward his son as if he had been slapped. He desperately tried to reclaim the ground he was rapidly losing. He scrambled to find his usual authoritative vocabulary, the language of control he had weaponized for over 2 decades. "Aurora, this is insane," Dean stammered, his voice cracking noticeably. "You are completely overreacting. We can handle this privately. You do not need to turn a personal family matter into a massive, destructive war. You are acting completely irrational." It was a pathetic, transparent attempt at gaslighting. For the very first time in our entire marriage, he could no longer define the situation using his own language. His words sounded thin, weak, and entirely unconvincing, even to himself. He was frantically trying to cast me as the hysterical, vengeful wife, but the meticulously organized, legally binding documents resting on his dinner plate completely destroyed his narrative. I did not rise to the bait. I did not raise my voice to defend my sanity. I did not chase him around the emotional maze he was desperately trying to construct. I simply remained seated in my chair, my hands resting calmly on the linen tablecloth. "There is no war, Dean," I replied, my tone perfectly even, completely devoid of any public emotion. "There is only a legal process. From this exact second forward, every single phone call, every email, every text message, and every proposed financial settlement will go directly through Nessa Hollis. You will not contact me directly. You will not attempt to negotiate with me in the driveway. If you try to access the joint accounts, the bank has already been instructed to flag the activity." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, completely unable to process the woman sitting across from him. He had spent his entire afternoon rehearsing a speech designed to neatly pack me away into a box of collateral damage. He never once considered that I had spent the last 8 months methodically dismantling the very ground he planned to walk on. With shaking hands, Dean gathered the papers, shoving them haphazardly back into the blue folder. He stood up, avoiding the piercing, disgusted glares of his own children. He turned and walked out of the dining room. The heavy front door opened and shut, lacking the usual solid, confident thud. As I listened to the engine of his car start in the driveway, I knew exactly what he was thinking. As he gripped the steering wheel, his mind was surely racing, desperately trying to calculate how much damage control he would need to perform on Monday morning. He genuinely believed that this folder was my entire arsenal. He thought this was a brilliant, aggressive defensive maneuver to secure the house and protect my assets. He drove away into the dark, entirely unaware that the paperwork he held in his trembling hands was merely the opening argument. He still had absolutely no idea that I had not yet dropped the most dangerous piece of evidence onto the board. When the heavy front door finally clicked shut that night, the silence that followed was not the devastating void I had always been conditioned to fear. It was the distinct, breathable air of a recently ventilated room. Dean did not immediately drive to Cedar Ridge to fall into the waiting arms of his new partner. True to his desperate need to control the optics of his own life, he leased a sterile, overpriced, short-term corporate condominium situated squarely in the downtown business district. He was fiercely determined to maintain the polished facade of a man executing an orderly, civilized transition. He wanted the local community and his professional peers to view this as a mutual, unfortunate parting of ways rather than a frantic escape from a burning building he had personally set on fire. However, the illusion of his controlled demolition lasted exactly 6 days. By the middle of the very first week, the meticulously drafted legal notice from my attorney hit the desks of the commercial underwriters. A major lending institution does not play games with disputed assets, and they certainly do not ignore a formal allegation of a forged guarantor signature. The bank immediately placed a hard, uncompromising freeze on all scheduled construction disbursements for the luxury venue. The massive flow of capital suddenly stopped dead. the fallout was instantaneous. Sloane Mercer, who had been confidently organizing high society catering menus and securing expensive floral deposits, suddenly found herself staring down a frozen credit line. The contractors demanded their scheduled payments, the wealthy investors began making nervous inquiries, and the grand, highly publicized opening timeline was abruptly shoved right up against the edge of a cliff. That was when the barrage of phone calls began. My phone screen lit up relentlessly. Day and night, Dean cycled through the entire spectrum of human desperation, leaving a trail of increasingly erratic voicemails. In the morning, he would call in a state of blistering self-righteous rage, accusing me of maliciously trying to destroy his career and sabotage his future out of pure, bitter spite. By late afternoon, his tone would shift into a condescending lecture, demanding that I stop acting like a child and answer the phone so we could sort this out like reasonable adults. But the most pathetic calls always came late at night, well past midnight, when the crushing reality of his isolated condominium finally set in. He would leave long, rambling messages pleading with me to just sit down with him for 1 hour over coffee, begging me to lift the financial hold, swearing that he never meant to hurt me. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer velocity of my defense. He had expected me to spend months crying on the sofa, leaving him entirely free to secure his new life before the dust settled. I did not answer a single call. I did not return a single text message. I felt the familiar, toxic urge to scream back at him, to validate my own pain by engaging in a bitter war of words, but I buried that instinct under a mountain of discipline. I adhered strictly to the battle plan Nessa and I had constructed. I simply forwarded every voicemail, every desperate email, and every demanding text directly to her office. I forced Dean to realize that I was no longer his wife. I was an opposing legal entity. Every single communication had to be documented, filtered through representation, and added to the permanent record. Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside the house by the lake began to fundamentally transform. The heavy, oppressive tension that had suffocated the rooms for the past 8 months slowly evaporated. Instead of wandering through the halls like a ghost mourning a dead marriage, I actively reclaimed the space. I started with the formal dining room, the very epicenter of his failed ambush. I pushed the massive mahogany table against the far wall and permanently converted the room into the central command center for my consulting business. I packed away the heavy, pretentious bronze bookends and the dark velvet drapes Dean had always insisted upon, replacing them with clean organizers and letting the crisp, unfiltered autumn light flood through the bare window panes. I opened the windows wide every single morning, letting the sharp breeze off the lake sweep through the hallways, physically airing out the lingering scent of his expensive cologne and his suffocating arrogance. For the first time in years, I began to sleep soundly through the night. The chronic, low-grade anxiety that used to keep my shoulders tense had vanished, replaced by the exhausting but deeply satisfying fatigue of a woman firmly in control of her own survival. The children also began to navigate the newly cleared air in their own distinct ways. Willa started coming over multiple evenings a week. She did not ask invasive questions or dwell on the painful details of her father's betrayal. Instead, she brought strong black tea, sat cross-legged on the floor of my new office, and helped me organize the rapidly expanding physical files of bank statements and property records. She became my silent, steadfast archivist. Rowan processed the fracture differently. He spent his weekend afternoons entirely outside in the biting cold. Without a single word of instruction, he bought treated lumber from the hardware store and meticulously began replacing the rotting planks on the tall wooden fence that bordered our backyard. I would stand by the kitchen window, holding a warm mug, watching my son carefully measure, cut, and secure the heavy wood. He was not just fixing a physical boundary. He was quietly, physically stating that this property was still a home, that it was still worth protecting, and that our family, though deeply wounded, was remaining firmly in place. Across town, the cracks in Dean's grand romantic narrative were rapidly widening. Sloane Mercer was an elite businesswoman who dealt strictly in the currency of aesthetics, social connections, and flawless execution. She had been sold the dream of a wealthy, soon-to-be bachelor who was merely waiting for the ink to dry on an amicable, highly lucrative divorce. She had confidently believed his arrogant assurances that our massive lake house would quickly be converted into liquid cash to float their shared ambitions. Now, she was intimately witnessing the ugly, undeniable truth. The man she thought was her wealthy savior was actually a massive financial liability. He was locked out of his own assets. His corporate funds were under intense legal scrutiny, and the wife he had casually dismissed as a compliant, dependent woman was currently holding the absolute control lever to their entire business venture. Yet, despite the walls actively crumbling around him, Dean remained stubbornly insulated by his own profound denial. He still could not mentally grasp the absolute finality of the situation. In his mind, he viewed the frozen bank accounts and the legal notices not as a fatal blow, but merely as a temporary tantrum thrown by a scorned woman. He genuinely believed that if he could just bypass the lawyers and corner me in a room, his sheer presence and his practiced authority would force me to back down. He thought a quick, early settlement offer, perhaps slightly more generous than his original insulting proposal, would easily soothe my ego and get his life back onto his carefully imagined track. He thought he was still playing a standard game of marital chess. He had absolutely no comprehension that the board had already been flipped. The pieces were scattered across the floor, and he was currently negotiating with a woman who had already secured the entire building. The surface of my husband's deception was a tired cliché, a younger, glamorous woman and a leased corporate condominium, but the foundation of his betrayal was a masterclass in calculated fraud. The forensic financial investigator Nessa and I had retained did not stop his search at the forged loan guarantee. He kept digging, plunging his hands deep into the muddy, convoluted waters of Dean's expense accounts and the operational ledgers of his employer, Meridian Habitat Supply. What he dragged up into the light was a highly sophisticated, deeply unethical system of financial engineering. The vague consulting fees we had initially flagged were not just casual, off-the-book side income. They were the lifeblood of a massive, systematic kickback scheme. Dean served as a regional director of procurement at Meridian. In that specific capacity, he held the unilateral authority to approve supply contracts up to $250,000 without ever requiring secondary executive oversight. Our investigator cross-referenced the newly approved vendors from the past 18 months and found a glaring, undeniable anomaly. Meridian had recently switched a massive portion of its logistics contracts to a newly formed, highly obscure transport and supply vendor. A quiet, thorough background check on the primary shareholder of this new corporate entity revealed a name that made the entire puzzle snap together with sickening clarity. The vendor was registered to a man who happened to be Sloan Mercer's first cousin. The mechanics of their theft were as simple as they were breathtakingly arrogant. Dean used his corporate authority to approve massively inflated invoices from Sloan's cousin. Meridian Habitat Supply blindly paid those inflated bills, bleeding corporate capital without realizing they were being actively drained from the inside. In return, the cousins siphoned the excess profit and funneled it directly into the accounts of Velvet Ember Hospitality, masking the illicit transfers as vaguely defined consulting and project management fees. Dean was essentially robbing his own employer blind to secretly finance his mistress's luxury commercial real estate venture. A lesser woman might have taken this explosive information and immediately detonated it in the public square. I could have easily leaked the documents to a local industry blog, sent a highly emotional, anonymous email to his entire sales division, or publicly shamed Sloan on her pristine, heavily curated social media pages. But public scandals are messy, unpredictable, and often paint the whistleblower as a bitter, vindictive spouse acting out of pure jealousy. I had absolutely no interest in public theater. I was dealing exclusively in the cold, hard currency of corporate compliance. I packaged the forensic accountant's detailed preliminary report, complete with the vendor invoices, the match dates, and the ownership records of the shell companies. I did not send it anonymously. I had Nessa draft a perfectly sterile, legally binding cover letter and we sent the entire dossier via certified overnight courier directly to the Chief Compliance Officer and the head of the Internal Ethics Board at Meridian Habitat Supply's corporate headquarters. The immediate ripple effect of that single courier package placed Sloan Mercer in a breathtakingly impossible position. She had built her entire professional brand on exclusivity, trust, and high society aesthetics. Suddenly, she was tethered to a man who was actively being investigated for severe corporate embezzlement. If she stayed with Dean and stood loyally by his side, she risked being dragged into a sprawling, multi-agency financial audit that would inevitably look into her own limited liability companies. She could easily face severe criminal liability as an accessory to fraud. But if she severed ties and abandoned him to protect her own pristine reputation, the grand, sweeping romance Dean had confidently sacrificed his family for would be instantly exposed for exactly what it was: a purely transactional arrangement built on stolen corporate capital. The intoxicating romance of their affair was rapidly evaporating, replaced by the terrifying, isolating chill of legal self-preservation. Sitting alone in his sterile, rented condominium, Dean finally began to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the war he had casually provoked. I was not just fighting him over the emotional division of the silverware or the holiday schedules of our adult children. I was not just contesting a standard, predictable divorce settlement. I was methodically peeling back every single layer of the fraudulent infrastructure he had spent the last 2 years building in the dark. I was systematically cutting the supply lines to his new life, dropping a barricade across every single exit he thought he had secured. He realized, with a creeping, suffocating dread, that he was no longer managing a disgruntled, heartbroken wife. He was actively bleeding out on a legal battlefield he did not even realize he had stepped onto until the first shots were fired. But the final, fatal puncture to his towering financial ego came from a completely different angle. While Nessa was meticulously executing our offensive strategy against his corporate assets, I was busy fortifying my absolute defense of our primary marital asset. I spent an entire Tuesday evening sitting on the floor of my newly converted office, carefully reading through the thick, dusty stack of closing documents from the major mortgage refinancing we had executed exactly 4 years ago. I was looking for a very specific piece of paper, and halfway through the second archival box, my fingers finally brushed against the heavy cardstock. When we refinanced the house to take advantage of plummeting interest rates, the commercial bank required an exhaustive accounting of our equity. Because the massive renovations, the custom upgrades, and the original down payment had been completely funded by my Aunt Marlowe's inheritance. I had quietly asked the closing attorney to draft a specific, legally binding addendum to the new deed of trust. The addendum explicitly stated that in the event of a marital dissolution or a forced sale of the property, the exact dollar amount of my separate inheritance funds, a sum stretching well into the high 6 figures, must be completely and unconditionally reimbursed to me directly off the top of the sale price before any remaining equity could be divided between us. I vividly remembered the lazy afternoon he signed it. We were sitting in a bright, sunlit conference room, drinking terrible office coffee. Dean had been entirely focused on his smartphone, aggressively typing out an email to a supplier. He had barely even glanced at the paper when the attorney slid it across the polished table. He simply picked up his heavy black pen and blindly scrawled his name on the bottom line. He did not read the fine print because, 4 years ago, he was a man comfortably at peace. He still believed the marriage was a permanent, unbreakable institution. He believed the house would always be his personal castle. He signed away his rights to my money with the careless, arrogant stroke of a man who never once imagined a future where he would have to pack his bags and leave his own kingdom. That single moment of peacetime carelessness had now become the massive, gaping hole in his wartime strategy. He had confidently stood at the head of my dining table just weeks ago and arrogantly declared that the house would be sold and the equity split to comfortably fund his new life. He was heavily banking on walking away with a massive, unearned financial payout. But the document resting quietly in my hands legally dictated that once my protected inheritance was fully reimbursed, the remaining equity on the property was effectively zero. There was no massive payout waiting for him. There was no golden parachute to soften his impending fall. He was about to be fired from his lucrative corporate job in absolute disgrace. His glamorous mistress was currently calculating the fastest, most brutal route to distance herself from his radioactive bank accounts. And the sprawling lake house he thought he owned outright was entirely, legally mine. The locks on the doors of his future had already been changed, and I was the one quietly holding all the keys. The mandatory mediation took place on a cold Tuesday morning in November, inside a sterile, slate-gray conference room at a neutral downtown law firm. The air conditioning hummed aggressively, making the room feel more like a surgical theater than a place for compromise. Dean walked through the heavy glass doors at precisely 9 o'clock. He wore a brand-new, flawlessly tailored navy suit and carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who firmly believed he still controlled the board. He had fired his initial attorney and hired a new, aggressively expensive litigator, a man whose reputation was built on scorched earth tactics and who billed at over $1,000 an hour. Dean wanted to project the absolute illusion that unlimited capital and unbroken confidence were still standing firmly on his side. They did not start the session with pleasantries or apologies. The new attorney unlatched his imported leather briefcase and immediately launched a ferocious, preemptive strike. He slid a thick, freshly printed spreadsheet across the polished table, accusing me of intentionally and maliciously concealing corporate revenue. He pointed to the income generated by my consulting firm, West Ledger Advisory, and claimed I had been secretly siphoning marital funds into offshore accounts. He was desperately attempting to equate my legally protected, heavily documented separate income with Dean's fraudulent corporate embezzlement. It was a classic, calculated bluff. He wanted to muddy the waters, to make the mediator view us both as equally untrustworthy actors, hoping the forged loan signature would suddenly seem like just another messy, mutual marital dispute rather than a standalone felony. Before Nessa could even address the absurd accusation, Dean's lawyer pivoted aggressively to the lake house. He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the table, his voice dripping with practiced condescension. He argued that the inheritance I received from my Aunt Marlowe had been hopelessly commingled with our joint assets over the past 2 decades. He boldly claimed that paying for a custom roof, a massive kitchen overhaul, and the substantial refinancing down payment out of a separate trust account did not legally matter because we both lived under that roof and shared that kitchen. He demanded an immediate 50-50 split of the property's massive equity, completely ignoring the documented reality of exactly whose money had built that equity. I sat perfectly still. I did not flinch, I did not roll my eyes, and I did not interrupt his aggressive, theatrical monologue. I let the expensive lawyer exhaust his breath. When the room finally fell silent, Nessa Hollis calmly unclasped her black portfolio. She did not raise her voice. She did not express outrage. She simply began dealing documents onto the gray table with the terrifying precision of a casino dealer who already knew the exact order of the cards. First came the forensic accounting flowchart. It was a beautifully structured, color-coded diagram tracing every single dollar of my consulting revenue directly from the client invoices into a legally compliant, individually taxed sole proprietorship account that had been established years before our separation. There was zero commingling. Every cent was accounted for and properly reported to the federal government. Then came the property records. Nessa laid out the original, stamped wire transfers from the estate of Marlowe Bennett. She produced the meticulously itemized contractor invoices bearing only my name, and finally, she delivered the lethal blow. She pulled out the refinancing addendum from exactly 4 years ago. She slid the heavy cardstock across the table, pointing a manicured finger directly at the bottom of the final page. There, resting plainly in black ink, was Dean's own signature. It was the exact, legally binding stroke of the pen where he had explicitly, formally acknowledged my separate financial interest in the property and agreed to fully reimburse those specific funds prior to any division of equity. Dean stared at his own handwriting. The blood slowly drained from his face. His expensive lawyer stopped talking. shifting highly uncomfortably in his leather chair as he read the ironclad addendum his client had conveniently forgotten to mention during their billing hours. Dean desperately tried to maintain his stoic, corporate mask. He opened his mouth, likely preparing to pivot to another manufactured grievance to regain his footing. But before a single word could leave his throat, the heavy silence of the conference room was shattered by the sharp, persistent vibration of his smartphone resting on the table. Dean glanced down at the glowing screen. I watched his eyes track the preview text. The notification was an urgent, high-priority email dispatched directly from the Global Human Resources Department of Meridian Habitat Supply. The Internal Ethics Board had officially completed their preliminary review of the vendor kickback scheme. The email bluntly stated that he was being placed on immediate, unpaid administrative leave pending a formal termination hearing. His corporate access badges were instantly deactivated, his company laptop was remotely locked, and his entire professional reputation was effectively incinerated in a single devastating paragraph. He picked up the phone with trembling fingers. As he stared in absolute horror at the corporate email, he frantically swiped to his private messages. He had been trying to reach Sloan Mercer all morning. The text threads were a sea of his own desperate messages with absolutely no replies. Sloan was a fierce survivor in the elite, cutthroat business world. She had already recognized the lethal toxicity of his sinking ship. Behind the scenes, she was actively negotiating with her own aggressive legal counsel to completely sever her limited liability company from his heavily scrutinized corporate funds. She was quietly erasing his name from her grand vision to save her own pristine social standing. She was abandoning him just as ruthlessly, just as coldly, as he had attempted to abandon his own family. The sheer weight of the realization washed over him, turning his skin a sickly, pale shade of gray. He suddenly possessed absolutely no leverage. His exorbitant six-figure salary, his expected annual bonuses, his prestigious title, and the glamorous woman he thought would validate his entire midlife reinvention were all evaporating simultaneously, right in front of his eyes. Yet, the sheer, staggering stubbornness of his ego refused to formally surrender. His attorney, recognizing that they were currently standing on a crumbling cliff, weakly suggested we pause the mediation and reconvene in a few weeks. Dean was clinging to the desperate, pathetic hope that the ongoing financial strain and the emotional exhaustion of the legal process would eventually wear me down. He thought if he just dragged the timeline out long enough, I would eventually grow tired and accept a heavily compromised settlement just to make the nightmare end. They fundamentally misunderstood the woman sitting across from them. I was not getting tired. I was not fatigued by the paperwork or the tense negotiations. On the contrary, as the final finish line approached, my mind grew sharper, colder, and infinitely more precise. I sat back in my chair and looked at the man who had tried to destroy me. I knew the true, satisfying climax of this entire ordeal was not going to happen over a ruined plate of prime rib, nor would it happen in this sterile, gray mediation room. The ultimate victory required absolute patience. I was perfectly willing to wait for the exact, undeniable moment when every single structural pillar of power he had ever relied upon snapped simultaneously under the crushing weight of the truth. The final hearing before the presiding judge did not resemble the dramatic, tear-soaked spectacles so often portrayed in daytime television dramas. I did not sit on the polished wooden witness stand and weep about my broken heart. I did not waste a single precious breath uttering the name of the woman he had chosen over his family. Emotional devastation holds absolutely no weight in a court of equity. The only currency that truly matters in that room is structural evidence. And my structural evidence was a legally impenetrable fortress. We presented a pristine, airtight case built entirely on 4 unshakable pillars: the malicious forgery of my signature, the intentional and documented dissipation of our joint marital assets, his fundamentally dishonest financial disclosures during the initial discovery phase, and the absolute, irrefutable proof of my separate inheritance deeply embedded in the financial foundation of our property. The presiding judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, formally entered Calvin Rhodes' comprehensive forensic document examination into the permanent legal record. With a single sharp strike of the judge's heavy wooden gavel, the entire legal reality of the Velvet Ember House commercial lease was permanently and irrevocably altered. The court officially recognized the signature on the guarantor line as a deliberate, fraudulent construct. In that exact fraction of a second, I was entirely legally severed from the catastrophic financial guarantee that my husband had so arrogantly tried to chain around my neck. He was now solely, personally, and completely liable for every single penny of the massive commercial debt he had acquired. Next, my attorney systematically walked the judge through the extensive financial timelines we had spent months preparing. She clearly and methodically demonstrated that the overwhelming majority of the physical and financial value added to our sprawling lake property originated directly from my Aunt Marlowe's estate, coupled with my own exhaustive, unpaid property management over the decades. In stark contrast, she presented the damning, highlighted ledgers proving that Dean had actively and secretly drained our joint checking and savings accounts. He had funneled thousands of dollars into obscure vendor payments, lavish weekend hotel stays, and expensive, intimate dinners, deliberately starving our marital estate to feed the illusion of his illicit second life, as if the universe had perfectly synchronized the complete and total collapse of his manufactured empire. The final, devastating blow arrived on the exact same afternoon as our court appearance. Meridian Habitat Supply issued its final, formal ruling regarding the internal ethics investigation. The preliminary suspension was immediately converted into a permanent termination with absolute cause. The corporate board of directors cited severe, unmitigated violations of their foundational code of conduct and egregious, undisclosed conflicts of interest that had cost the company significantly. The penalty was absolute and unforgiving. Every single one of his unvested corporate stock options was entirely revoked. His massive, highly anticipated annual performance bonus, the exact money he had banked on to fund his new life, was permanently frozen and formally seized by the company to offset the massive financial damages caused by his fraudulent vendor approvals. When Dean finally walked into the small, wood-paneled mediation room for the ultimate settlement negotiations, he was a hollow, fading shell of the arrogant executive who had stood at the head of my dining table just months prior. He had absolutely no corporate leverage left to manipulate. He had no future luxury project to brag about, and he had no glamorous partner waiting in the wings to validate his midlife reinvention. He possessed nothing but a rapidly accumulating, suffocating mountain of legal fees and a severely permanently compromised public reputation. He approached the heavy wooden table with entirely empty hands, facing the exact, terrifying destitution that he had so confidently and casually planned for me. The final legal decree was absolute and highly favorable to the truth. The court awarded me the exclusive, undisputed ownership and possession of the lake house, entirely free and clear of his influence. The settlement guaranteed the immediate, priority reimbursement of my entire separate inheritance directly from whatever remaining liquid assets managed to survive his reckless spending. I was awarded the vast majority of our adjusted retirement portfolios to mathematically balance the joint funds he had selfishly squandered on his affair. Most importantly, a strict ironclad indemnification clause was cemented into the final judgment. It explicitly stated that Dean was entirely and solely responsible for any and all civil liabilities, banking penalties, or aggressive investor lawsuits arising from his forged documents and his spectacularly failed commercial venture. When I finally pushed open the heavy double doors and walked out of the stifling courtroom, the crisp, cool air of the marble hallway felt like the very first real breath I had taken in over a year. Willa and Rowan were waiting for me on a long wooden bench near the main elevators. They had not come to the downtown courthouse to maliciously watch their father be systematically dismantled by the justice system. They had come to bear witness to my absolute, hard-won liberation. They stood up in unison as I approached. Willa stepped forward and wrapped her arms tightly around my shoulders, her grip fierce and profoundly protective. Rowan offered a quiet, deeply respectful nod, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of the brutal, necessary war I had just successfully navigated. They were there to proudly watch their mother walk into a bright, open future where she would never again have to ask for permission to hold on to her own life. Nearly 1 full year later, the harsh, biting chill of winter had faded, and the quiet lake town of Briar Point was bathed in the warm, golden light of early autumn. The sprawling craftsman house was completely silent, but it was no longer the suffocating, heavy silence of a woman anxiously waiting for an inevitable disaster to strike. It was the peaceful, deeply resonant quiet of a sanctuary that had been fully and permanently reclaimed. I stood alone in the center of the completely renovated dining room. The dark, oppressive velvet curtains that Dean had always demanded were completely gone, replaced by light, airy linen panels that caught the gentle evening breeze rolling off the water. I reached into the tall glass display cabinet and carefully pulled out the heavy, ornate crystal goblets inherited from my Aunt Marlowe. I washed them slowly by hand, standing at the kitchen sink, watching the golden afternoon light refract beautifully through the intricate cut glass. I was preparing another elaborate, heavy dinner, but tonight was absolutely not a hollow anniversary honoring a lie. It was a genuine celebration of survival. Willa was currently driving up from the city, bringing a new, bawdy vintage of wine she was incredibly excited to share. Rowan was already outside in the backyard, laughing loudly over a podcast as he fired up the custom stone grill he had built over the summer. The air inside the house was rich and inviting, filled with the smell of roasting garlic, fresh aromatic herbs, and the distinct, clean scent of the freshwater lake. As I set the final, gleaming crystal glass on the smooth wooden table, I took a moment to look around the room. It was the very first meal of a family that had finally stopped living underneath the suffocating, demanding shadow of a man who always believed he was the absolute center of the universe. Dean thought he was leaving a wife who could not live without him. He had no idea that I, Aurora West, had quietly detached my future from his collapse long before the first candle was ever lit. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.